fortifications and minefields, attacking over dunes considered impassable by the Egyptian defenders. Fierce hand-to-hand fighting followed the tank battle, and the main towns fell before dusk on the first day. Egyptian tanks fell prey to well-armed and efficient infantry. Israeli tank commanders were also frequent casualties, a result of fighting from open turrets. Some trenches were only cleared after bitter exchanges. But it was accomplished with little loss of momentum to the offensive. The strategy continually was to trap and encircle enemy armor and destroy it as it tried to break out. The Israelis entered Gaza on Tuesday lunchtime, halfway through the second day after what they described as a brutal battle. But the pause, like the welcome, would be short-lived. Thousands of mines had to be cleared from the deep echelons of the Egyptian defensives. But as some rested momentarily, others fought street battles to flush out the last resistance by Egyptian commandos. It was a bitter and unexpected defeat for the Egyptians. The Egyptian commander in Gaza, Major General Abdul Munah Husseini, still looks bewildered by the speed of his force's demise as he signs the surrender document, hastily scribbled out on a scrap of paper by his Israeli captors. Further west, Wessex helicopters brought in paratroopers by night to outflank Egyptian strongpoints in the most important battle of the Sinai theatre for Abu Agheila. Here, the Israeli offensive was led by a future defense minister, General Ariel Sharon. Once they reached the main Egyptian defensive positions, Sharon brought forward the divisional artillery units to soften them up by persistent bombardment. Abu Agheila fell at lunchtime on the second day after what was probably the most complicated battle of all the Arab-Israeli wars. By Wednesday, Egyptian forces were fleeing for safety beyond the Suez Canal. Israeli training aircraft, modified to take rockets, joined the attack on the disintegrating Egyptian armies. They swooped on the fleeing convoys as they converged on the bottleneck of the Mitla Pass, just 20 kilometers from the Suez Canal. Mirage 3s, recently brought from France, were also bombed up. Refueling, rearming and changing pilots took just 7 minutes before the next series of strikes that decimated the Egyptian army east of Suez. The 3 Israeli brigades were now being closely coordinated to prevent them mistakenly firing on each other. Seven Egyptian divisions, 70,000 men, were totally destroyed in scenes that became famous around the world. In many cases, vehicles and weapons were simply abandoned in the haste to get back to the Suez Canal. Hundreds of vehicles littered the landscape. With the dramatic collapse of the Egyptian army, the way was wide open to the Suez Canal. In front of them, fewer than 100 of the Egyptians' 1,000 tanks managed to cross the canal to safety. Their rout had been compounded by conflicting orders from the Egyptian commander, Field Marshal Abdul Hakim Ammar, which created panic in the defeated army. The strategic rail bridge over the canal was reached on the 4th afternoon. But none of the troops who relaxed along the canal banks that Thursday would say that it had been easy.
I have seen it to be not very easy. They were fighting from house to house. You can see the shells in the houses here, that people had to fight from house to house. Most of it was done by the tanks, the light tanks.
Yes, he is one from the big fighters here.
How good was the Egyptian fighting yesterday?
Not very bad, but we are better.
In the east, the Israelis began by cutting off Jerusalem from the bulk of the Jordanian army in the north, which also found itself quickly under fire. Further offensives north of Jerusalem seized control of the Judean hills. Within 3 days, most major centres west of the Jordan were in Israeli hands, including the ancient cities of Jericho and Bethlehem. The Jerusalem corridor was the key to control of the Judean hills and Jerusalem, for it overlooks all approaches to the holy city itself. Its strategic importance had been recognized in ancient times by Joshua. The Harold Brigade was sent in to secure it after Jordan had opened hostilities with an artillery barrage. They advanced on the strategic Radar Hill in difficult mountainous terrain where well-fortified Arab Legion positions covered all approaches. A crucial tank battle was fought by night, the Israelis' old Sherman tanks using their searchlights to pick out targets regardless of the risk to their own columns. The brigade finally broke through the Jordanian lines to seize the mountain ridge and road connecting Jerusalem and Ramallah. And Israeli jets used their air supremacy to decimate fortified positions outside Jerusalem and any attempts to reinforce them. The battle for Nablus was typical of the Jordanian front. It was largely an urban affair, fought over the streets and buildings of cities and towns with deep religious connotations for Jews, Muslims and Christians alike. Just as in Vietnam, half a world away, the medevac teams were helicoptered into battlefield situations to take out the wounded. Reservists taken prisoner while still in civilian dress were evidence of the speed of the Israeli assault. Nonetheless, the Jordanians, with the smallest of the Arab armies, proved to be the only ones to inflict damage on Israel as the conflict unfolded. Jerusalem's Wailing Wall was reached on the 4th day, the Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Dayan posting prayers of thanks. This was a deeply religious site denied them under the 1947 partition, but staying there would fuel Arab anger for years to come. The battles for control of what is now known as the West Bank flowed through buildings and fortified positions honeycombed with complex reinforced defences. Here was where they met the men of the Arab Legion's El Hashim and Hittin brigades, their most effective opponents. In the towns, troops found heavily defended buildings, some several stories high, all interconnected by deep trenches and protected by minefields. Here, too, the Israelis suffered half their fatal casualties of the entire war. once again, it was the potent firepower of the Israeli Air Force that broke the threatened deadlock, as an emotional King Hussein acknowledged in defeat.
The battle was waged against us mainly from the air, almost exclusively from the air, with such overwhelming strength and continued sustained air attack on every single unit, on every single formation of our armed forces, day and night, right till last night.
Thereafter, Israeli troops swiftly occupied villages and towns of both religious and political importance to Muslims, Jews and Christians alike. Here, Jericho, whose walls had fallen without a fight, just as in biblical times. Jordan, a reluctant ally of the Egyptians, had, in population terms, lost half its kingdom. Bethlehem was among the last Jordanian towns to be occupied. Little resistance was encountered because, lacking reinforcements, the bulk of the Jordanian forces had been skillfully withdrawn. Also on the move, a trickle at first, the people whose plight would prove to be the one matter that prevented any attempt at a lasting peace, the Palestinians. Already, Arab propaganda was warning them that there would be no safe haven for them in the occupied territories. The desire to flee was further fueled by the fact that Jordan and other Arab countries paid them remittances. These would be unavailable if they remained in the West Bank. Few did remain to support the suggestion of a Palestinian homeland in the West Bank territory, and the opportunity to use their plight as a political weapon was not lost on the defeated Arab nations. The formidable natural obstacle of the Golan Heights dominated the northern offensive against Syria. Israel's strategy involved three main thrusts to take Quneitra. Two further offensives literally bulldozed their way to command the road to Damascus before a United Nations ceasefire line halted the advance. The Golan Heights dominate Israel from a plateau up to 1,200 meters above the Jordan Valley. With gun emplacements, deep trenches and dug-in tanks, the Syrians had converted the area into a deep defense zone. From here, sporadic artillery and gunfire was directed onto Israeli settlements. Briefing the officers who would lead the assault, the Israelis stressed how Syrian deployments obviously relied on the difficulties of the terrain to aid their defenses. Israeli armor moves north. Freed from fighting in Sinai after the Egyptian collapse, heavy brigades moved swiftly through Israel to face the Syrians. Moshe Dayan had hesitated